I'm the Moral Money editor at the Financial Times as of about 6 weeks ago. And for the 2 years before that, I was on the road traveling through 26 countries on 6 continents to write this book, Race for Tomorrow, which is about looking at how people in every part of the world, from the richest to the poorest, in every walk of life, are responding to the extraordinary challenge that we have before us. So we're going to start off with a short video. I'll hand over to that.
It's the greatest race in human history. It will tilt the balance of international power. It will create fortunes of colossal scale, and destroy them too. It will upend communities and whole civilizations in every part of the planet, and push some of them into a fight for survival. And it's already begun. Join me on a journey through a changing planet, meeting the people in the front lines of the climate crisis, and the changes that it sent cascading through the modern world. From indigenous people in the Brazilian Amazon, battling against the destruction of their rainforest by illegal cattle farming, to the startup venture in Iceland that's sucking carbon dioxide from the air and turning it into underground stone. We'll see how rising oceans are devastating island villages in the South Pacific, while driving a vast wave of migration in Bangladesh. And how Greenland's vanishing ice is promising an economic boom, even as it threatens the ancient traditions of its ice hunters. From Guangzhou to Silicon Valley, we'll meet tycoons fighting for pole position in the market for electric cars, and the Congolese miners risking their lives to dig up the minerals for the batteries that power them. Across the world, we'll see how climate change is throwing some of the planet's most powerful industries into turmoil, as an army of high-powered startups scrambles to make billions by taking their place. It's a cast of characters from every walk of life and every corner of the globe, all of them playing their part in the biggest story of the century.
So I'm very grateful to the publisher for putting that video together. It was using my footage from various places that I went to on the road. So the reason for writing the book, I came to it not as an activist or as an environmental journalist. I came to it really as a reporter in the more traditional sense, recognizing that this is simply the biggest story of our time from the point of view of what's happening in global politics and the global economy, and of course in the individual lives of millions, indeed billions of people all over the world. So I started traveling full-time in the middle of 2019, and obviously COVID broke out about 9 months into my travels. That complicated things somewhat, but I managed to keep on moving. And it was an extraordinary experience to see the ways in which people at every level of the income ladder are affected by this. Some of the people I met were among the richest people in the world, billionaires, tycoons in China and Silicon Valley. Some of them were among the poorest. You can see the slideshow behind me. This will be playing throughout the talk today. These are photos that I took of the various people that I met along the road. This, for example, is Edda Aradottir, who's the head of Carbfix. It's a company in Iceland that is using their new technology to suck carbon dioxide from the air and turn it into stone underground. It's one example of many of the extraordinary technological advances that are being deployed by people around the world in response to these challenges. So if we have enough people who are watching, the way I normally do these talks is in the Q&A format, rather than me giving my personal opinions on things straight off the cuff. It's good for me to hear what questions people have on how people in these countries that I saw along the road are responding to these challenges. It's not about me just giving my opinions. I want to be able to share the viewpoints of the people that I met, most of whom cannot themselves be here in Glasgow. So I'd like to know if anyone in the audience has any questions to get us started then. And we also, by the way, for those watching online, you're very welcome to pitch in with your questions via the internet.
Yeah, did you meet anyone in heavy industry and mining, such as lithium mining they were talking about in the last session?
Yeah, so that was something which is a big focus for me, because it was important for me not only to focus on one side of the story, not only to focus on, for example, the victims of climate change or the people who are looking to save the world through new technology, but looking at the people who are the most exposed to the existing fossil fuel economy. So for that, I focused in particular on two countries. One of them was Australia. So Australia, as you probably know, big coal producing country, big coal exporting country, the biggest coal exporter in the world. And so heading down there, it was very interesting to see the different perspectives that people have. So, for example, I met a man named Adrian Burugaba, who'll be, at some point, he'll appear in the slideshow behind us. So he's the leader of an Aboriginal community called the Wangan and Jagalingo community. And they're in Queensland, in the northwest of Australia. Sorry, northeast of Australia. And their ancestral land is being developed by an Indian company called Adani. It's a hugely controversial project in Australia. It's among the most politically divisive fossil fuel projects in the world. And the way that Adrian described it to me was, as far as he's concerned, you have these two very different approaches to the way that life should be lived, the way that a human community should operate. So traditionally, the Aboriginal people of Australia, they lived from the land. They didn't believe in exploiting the land through agriculture, or certainly not heavy industry. It was about living with the land, in a real synergy with the land. Then the British arrived and imposed a very different sort of approach, which was much more based upon extraction, developing the land, and so on. So when it gets to the point where it's actually physically destroying his people's sacred sites, for him that was that taken to its ultimate extreme. But then, of course, there are people with very different views in Australia. So I went to one town called Mackay, which is one of the big mining cities in the country, where I sat in at a breakfast of a group called the Resource Industries Network. This is a lobby group of people involved in the coal sector. And they were very keen to distance themselves from the extremists. They were saying, we believe that the climate science is accurate, but they were saying that if we stop mining coal, we don't think it will help, because the coal that's going to the power stations in India, for example, it will just come from other mines instead of ours. In fact, one of these people was arguing, because Australian coal is relatively less filthy than coal from some other places, he actually said the best thing Australia can do for the climate is to mine as much of our high-quality coal as we possibly can. Right, so it's a very provocative argument. I don't agree with that argument, but it's not the same as simply saying we don't believe that climate change is happening. So I think there's a sort of tendency to oversimplify the argument and talk as though people in the coal industry are rejecting the science. Some of them are, but not all of them. And it was particularly interesting towards the end of my trip to visit BHP. So that's the biggest mining company in the world, down in Melbourne. And I met a woman called Fiona Wild. And she's the head of climate issues at BHP. And she's in a tough job, right? Because BHP, biggest mining company in the world, huge carbon emissions, and they're committed to eventually becoming net zero. So how do you do that? And it's not clear how to get there. But she was making the point that, as far as she's concerned, it's no longer just about saying the right things. It's actually about the survival long term of the business. if the business just keeps on trashing the planet, you may not have to pay a really punitive cost for that now, but they believe that's where it's going with regulations and taxes in the future. And so they're trying to move to address that. But they're under a lot of scrutiny, and that's as it should be, I think. So we have a question here from a couple of questions now from online, which is cool. So one is from Bryn in Austria. And Bryn wants to know which country of those I saw was most impacted by the climate crisis. That would have to be Ethiopia. And it was one place in particular in Ethiopia called Afar, which not many people get to because it's not very comfortable to travel through Afar. There's a place in the north of Afar which is called the Danakil Depression. It's the hottest inhabited place in the world. The only reason why anyone lives there is because there's a lot of salt. You can mine the salt and make money from it, but it's above 50 degrees while you're working. So brutal, brutal conditions out there. I was not in Danakil itself, I was in a different part of Afar. The people there have always been very poor. They're nomadic herders. They always lived from cattle. That was their traditional way of life. They had cattle plus other animals. The cattle are all gone now. There's no cows left in the whole area of Afar that I saw. Now it's mostly camels and goats, and you can see the ribs of every single camel and goat in the area that I saw. The whole community of humans and animals is suffering very badly, and the reason why, so they had several years of drought, unprecedented extreme drought. Finally there was rain, long-awaited rainfall, which then brought a flood of locusts. So you just got this whammy upon whammy upon whammy of climate impacts for people who are already really on the borderline. The locusts bred in the Arabian Peninsula, where there have been a couple of massive cyclones, again, driven by climate impacts. Not normal to have that sort of cyclone in Arabia. Creates the breeding conditions for the locusts, which then flew over the Bab el-Mandeb Strait into the Horn of Africa and just started eating everything in sight. So it's a rough thing to see. It's not clear what ends up happening to the people of Afar, the herders. They have been going through an extraordinarily tough time. They used to be able to eat normally, right? They were never rich, but they had meat, they had access to dairy products from their animals, and they were reasonably healthy people. Now, the only thing that any of them have to eat is handouts from the government trucks that come through the area once a month. And to my knowledge, there's no one from Afar here at COP26, right? You have delegates from Ethiopia, and it's very important that we have delegates from Ethiopia, but there's still a problem of representation in terms of the people who are really suffering, the people who are really feeling the worst effects. Their government leaders might be here, but I do think that if there were more of those people actually on the ground in Glasgow sharing their stories, it would be a different sort of conversation. So you've got more questions coming in online. Please do keep them coming in. Another question in terms of which country more broadly left the biggest impact on me personally. Mongolia was an extraordinary experience. Mongolia in the winter is like nothing I've ever seen before. Temperatures of minus 30 degrees, unbelievably beautiful landscapes. I mean, it's just spectacular. It's so empty as a country. You've got miles and miles of rolling plains and mountains, all covered in snow. So it's beautiful, but again, people there are struggling. The story in Mongolia is a bit more counterintuitive compared with some of the other climate impacts, because the problem that I was seeing in Mongolia was extreme winter conditions. So it's not just about extreme heat and drought. Those are the things that we hear a lot about. And of course, the average temperature of the planet is going up. But in Mongolia, you're seeing extreme cold and extreme snowfall. And it tells you something about how complicated the impacts of climate change are. It's happening because you've got accelerating ice melts in the Arctic, which is really disrupting the movement of moisture and heat energy right across the Northern Hemisphere. So you might remember in Texas this last winter, we saw extraordinary winter conditions that pretty much shut down the state of Texas. Similar thing to what's driving these conditions in Mongolia. So for the people that I met there, this was in the far northwest of Mongolia, where people are living much like they were in the days of Genghis Khan. Right, so Genghis Khan, in those days, Mongolia, the Mongols, built one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen. They conquered all the land from Hungary right through to Korea. So they're tough, tough people. And they still live much in the same way. They still wear the same clothing. They still ride with the same saddles. But for the first time, it's, at least many of them would say, for the first time in their history, it's becoming unsustainable because of these extreme winter conditions. So it was, for me personally, it was a strange experience, because it was an amazing experience, to be honest, to see this extraordinary culture and way of life, which may not, if I have kids, 20 years' time, 30 years' time, it might not be there for them to see. So it's an incredible privilege to see that culture. But incredibly tough to see how much they're being hit. I mean, their animals are just dying in large numbers year after year. So that was a strange experience. It was a privilege, but it was tough. Great, lots more questions coming in. Coral. Coral's important. Thank you, Billy, for that question. How have you seen the coral reef impacted? And are you confident that getting to 1.5 degrees would reverse the dire situation? Unfortunately, the coral's in big trouble, according to the IPCC. If we manage to restrain temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, we might be able to save 10% of the world's coral in the long run. If it goes above 2 degrees, as you know, we're on track for way above 2 degrees at the moment. If it goes above 2 degrees, it's 99% gone. So maybe all of it. So I saw the coral in the Maldives. I was lucky to meet some really interesting people in the Maldives, including Mohammed Nasheed, who's the former president. He's here this week as well. And he's had an extraordinary life. He was a freedom fighter under the old dictatorship. He was imprisoned and tortured. He became the country's first ever democratically elected president. And in that role, he started fighting to try and save his country from total devastation from climate change. So he told me about this when we met in the capital, Male. And the problem is that the Maldives is one of 4 countries in the world that are completely composed of coral sand. So the highest point in the Maldives is 2 meters above sea level. Most of it is the height of a child above sea level. And unfortunately, on our current track, the Maldives will not exist in anything like its current form in 100 years from now, and potentially less than that, potentially much less than that. So when I met Nasheed in Male, he was saying the only thing that's going to save the Maldives is the coral. So the Maldives are created by coral. The islands sit in the middle of these circular rings of coral reefs, and they're created by the debris that comes from it. So historically, as sea level has changed at the beginning and end of ice ages, for example, the level of the coral rose as the water rose. The trouble is that now, for the first time ever, you're looking at the coral being dead. So that leaves no hope for the islands. So Nasheed is talking about how technology can be used to save the coral. Genetic modification, these sorts of things, to really give new life to these amazing life forms. And I had the privilege of going diving there in the Maldives and seeing up close a bleached coral reef, which, if you didn't know what you were seeing, you might think it was beautiful. It's just this otherworldly, pure white formation. And you only realize how ugly a bleached coral reef is when you've seen a coral reef that is not bleached, when you've seen how incredibly beautiful these things are. So I hope Nasheed is right. He's now here, by the way. He was critically injured in a bomb attack earlier this year, and it's fantastic to see him back representing his country again. He's fully recovered. It's inspiring. And I hope he's right, that there's hope for the coral. Great, loads of questions coming in. How do I feel about Xi Jinping not attending? Honestly, I think the China conversation is very complicated, right? So I was talking about it with someone earlier today. I think, as far as I can see, and based on my travels for the book in China, Xi Jinping has decided that the long-term future of the Chinese economy and Chinese power in the world depends upon being the energy superpower of the clean energy era. So I think everything that China is doing in clean energy is designed to achieve that leading position. So be that in electric cars, in solar power, in wind, in batteries. Some really impressive work. But in the shorter term, China is heavily dependent on coal power. China is not willing to shut that down. They have a lot of short-term priorities that need a lot of baseload power. So it's both, right? In the short term, China is obviously doing a lot of things that are unhelpful to the climate, principally coal power plants. But in the long term, they're committed to green energy, not purely because of green motivations, but because they can see that's where the global economy is going. And during my travels, if you read the book, you can hear from some of the top Chinese clean energy entrepreneurs. He Xiaobang, for example, who's the head of XPeng Motors, one of the most high-profile Chinese electric car companies. And he was just saying to me, look, I mean, we want to beat Tesla. We think we can. We think we can beat them on quality. We think we can beat them on price. I mean, we'll see if he's right on that. He's talking a big game. But he's one of many really interesting Chinese entrepreneurs who are simply seeing that this is the big opportunity. If you want to make megabucks in the 21st century in China, there's no more exciting area than clean energy. Dairy farming, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a big one, right? I mean, especially for the forests. The Amazon in Brazil was another quite grueling part of the journey. So, for example, one of the people I mentioned in the book, he'll be behind me at some point, Awapu, Uruewawao, his tribe, the Uruewawao, they were completely uncontacted by the modern world until the 1980s. And they were contacted by modern Brazil, so almost immediately a large number of them died of things like the cold and the flu. They didn't have immunity to them. And then more recently, they're being hit by violence. So a few months before we met, Awapu's brother-in-law had been murdered by these people who are trying to take their land. And why are they trying to take the land? It's actually, it's cattle farming, but not so much for dairy. It's mainly for beef. That's the big industry out there. And that is what is driving the deforestation of the Amazon more than any other single factor. So I heard from Awapu about the work that he's got this little sort of battalion of young friends and relatives who are trying to fight off this threat. There are only 80 people in the whole tribe. And so basically all of the young people in the tribe have come together to form this little unit to try and defend their area. So that was powerful. And then later, I met people on the other side, right? So I met a man called Ezio. And I just met him with my guide, Marco, who was a former soldier, so I felt comfortable in his company. We were driving down a road in the Amazon region, and we saw this enormous plume of smoke coming from the middle of the forest. So we followed it to see where it was coming from, and it was coming from Ezio. So here was this young man with a machete and a jerry can, just burning a whole section of the rainforest. And so I went and spoke to him, and we said, yeah, what are you doing? Why are you burning the forest? And he said, well, look, it's easy for you. You come from a rich country. You have many options as to what you do with your life. I have two options. I can be poor, or I can destroy a section of rainforest and raise cattle. And it's interesting to me also that he was completely unafraid of speaking to me, because in Brazil at the moment there is total impunity under the current Brazilian president. There is no fear of being caught for doing these things. So, and then the final part of my Brazilian trip was in Sao Paulo, where I visited JBS. So JBS is the biggest meat company in the world. It's the second biggest food company after only Nestle. It's got double the revenue of McDonald's. And JBS are under pressure, right? Because they are being accused of having cattle from illegally deforested land in their supply chain. And there are people who are saying, we're not going to buy this food, we're not going to buy food from the supermarkets that source this Brazilian beef. So they're under huge pressure to fix it. Not only, I hope they do want to do the right thing, but not only for that, but because if they don't, it's a real threat to their business. Yeah, the Pacific. So there have been some photos. This is the Pacific. This is the Solomon Islands. This is Elias Pilua. So Elias lost his home to sea level rise on his island. It's called Fanale. The sea level around the Solomon Islands has been rising much faster than almost any other part of the world. It's to do with movements in the trade winds, which are themselves caused by climate change. So the Solomons, if you don't know, they're sort of to the northeast of Australia, but quite far to the northeast of Australia in the South Pacific. And it's very, very tough for these people who are seeing their communities divided. You've got these very close-knit village communities in the South Pacific that are just being scattered because of these impacts. And not only are they being scattered and divided, the individual communities, but they are being brought into conflict in some cases with other communities, because Elias, for example, was telling me that he had left his island because his home was destroyed. There was no more space on his island to build a new home. So he moved across to a different island, which was bigger, and built a home there. But now he's under constant threat of eviction because there are people already living there, and they say that he's trespassing on their land. So you're ending up with this conflict between people who are all victims in their way of something that is being driven primarily from the rich countries. And what was interesting to me is that both Elias and the people like him, and the people on the other side, who I also spoke to, who they're in this conflict with, both said, doesn't it make sense that the rich countries should help us out here? You know, even the guy who's in an argument with Elias, he was saying, it's not Elias's fault. I feel sorry for Elias, but I'm not willing to give him my land because I need my land. Why aren't the rich countries stepping in since it's their responsibility? And honestly, being there as a citizen of a rich country, the UK, I was not going to argue with that because I think they have a point. Yeah, the youth climate action movement, is that having an impact on climate change policy? What did you learn from the younger people you met traveling? Well, the answer is I learned a lot. So there's a couple of people and sort of movements that are mentioned in particular in the book. So one of them is a young woman called Johanna Sustento from the Philippines, and almost her entire family was wiped out by Typhoon Haiyan. She's someone who I think ideally she should be at COP26, sharing her story herself. She's not, so I'm trying to do the best I can to share it on her behalf, and hopefully she'll be at the next COP. So I met her when she was doing a demonstration outside the office of Shell in Manila. And she was making an argument that Shell, so the reason why she chose Shell was that the year before this demonstration, Shell had been extraordinarily profitable. Shell had paid out $20 billion in dividends to its shareholders, more than any other company in the world, more than Apple or anyone else. And the CEO had earned $62,000 per day. And Joanna made the point, which I think is quite a strong point, that this reflects a problem with the system. Because the only reason why Shell has so much money to give to its shareholders and its executives is because Shell is not paying the costs of the economic costs that are imposed by its emissions, right? They're being paid by people like Joanna's family and the people of her city, which was flattened. So I found that quite a powerful argument, and I think the way in which she makes it is very powerful. It's non-violent, it's peaceful, it's thoughtful. And that, for me, is really the calling card of the new generation of climate activists who have been having such a powerful impact. When I started this book, the research for it in 2017, climate change was nowhere near as prominent in the news agenda as it is today. Now it's everywhere, of course. And I think there are many factors behind that, but I think the single biggest one is the extraordinary rise of the youth climate movement. And I think you have to give Greta Thunberg individually a lot of credit for that. I think the Fridays for Future movement specifically has made a huge change. Another movement that's featured in the book is Extinction Rebellion Venezia in Venice, Italy. And they were inspired by the British Extinction Rebellion movement, but they do it differently. And they said, what worked in London doesn't work in Venice. We don't want to create conflict with people. We want to simply engage with people. They volunteer in the community, these sorts of things. So that was interesting to me. I think there are many who would say that the more combative tactics of XR in the UK are counterproductive. Others who would say that that's what you need to do in a country like the UK to really get noticed. I don't know the right answer on that, but it's really interesting to see the different approaches that people are taking in different places to drive the conversation forward. But the conversation is obviously being driven forward. And I think this young generation of people in their teens and 20s is having an incredibly powerful effect, undeniably. Yeah, permafrost. It's great because all of these questions are about things that I actually covered. So permafrost is scary. It's really scary. So I went to Siberia. It's the first chapter of the book. So permafrost, for those who don't know, it is frozen ground. And most of it has been frozen since the last ice age, so 10,000 years or so. And it's now thawing in quite significant volumes. The permafrost area of Siberia is the size of China plus Afghanistan plus Nigeria combined, right? So just visualize that for a minute, and now it's starting to thaw. So what happens when it thaws? It's like if you switch off your freezer and leave it for a few weeks. It becomes disgusting, right? It rots, it gives off gas. But that's what's happening right across Siberia. So it emits huge amounts of carbon dioxide and methane. But some of the people on the ground in Siberia are actually finding this quite good news, because hidden within the permafrost, and again, you'll have seen somewhere along the line there'll be a picture of that melting permafrost, and some of the people who are searching for mammoth tusks within it. So there's enormous demand for mammoth tusks from China. China has cracked down on elephant ivory to stop elephant poaching. So instead, people have started looking for mammoth tusks from Siberia. And these things are enormous. I mean, they're sort of half the length of this stage or even longer. And they can fetch, once they've been finely engraved, they can fetch over $1 million, and they end up on display at some restaurant in Hong Kong or a casino in Macau. So I went there and I got on a very uncomfortable boat for a very long time, a little sort of motorboat, headed up this river overnight, and found myself at an illegal tusk hunters camp. And they were a little bit nervous because it was an illegal hunting camp, but they were eventually happy to share their story. And they just said, look, I mean, we know that this is bad for the climate, but ultimately we can make money from this. And they were not, unlike Ezio in the Amazon, they were not sort of driving it to the same extent. But there's a lot of interesting things happening there. There's another couple of stories around that, which I won't go into now. One to do with the impact on people's houses. You've got people in Siberia who are finding that, I went to one of these villages, they're finding that the ground beneath their homes is giving way because it was frozen ground. It's now thawing, it becomes soft and sludgy. So again, these people are having to move away. Eventually, it's going to form potentially a hole that consumes their whole village. And the third thing, extraordinary story that I found up in Siberia, way in the northeast, getting towards Alaska, there's a man named Sergei Zimov. He's a very prominent scientist, and he is trying to create a home for engineered mammoths, which he thinks is going to be potentially the key to holding back the thaw of the permafrost. I won't go into why. Now you have to read the book and find out. So, what can governments do to help those most affected by climate change in the global south? Yeah, this is a tough one. And I don't have the answers, but I think there needs to be more conversation around that. As you know, I'm sure a lot of people watching this will know, there was a pledge that the rich countries were going to deliver $100 billion a year in climate-related assistance to developing nations by 2020. Didn't even come close. And COVID has been used as an excuse. I hope that target would have been missed, would have been hit without the pandemic, but I don't know. But it's way, way behind. But beyond just the focus on the amount, obviously there needs to be much more conversation about how that money is used. As we know, large amounts of assistance, international assistance, these days goes missing through corruption and inefficiency and waste. That can't be allowed to happen with this sort of assistance, with the climate response. And I really think that there needs to be a really, really careful thought about how that money is distributed, especially in countries that are not, where the government has gained power without winning an election freely and fairly. These are tough questions to ask. There are politicians at the moment, I can think of at least two politicians, leaders of developing countries, who became elected through elections that were riven with fraud and violence and intimidation, and are now treated as voices representing the interests of developing country people as a whole, because people in the rich countries tend not to pay much attention to news events that happen in developing countries. And I get it, it's a lot of news to stay on top of, but I think if we're going to be serious about addressing this crisis and helping the countries that are worst hit, we can't just throw money at people in distant countries and leave it at that. We need to think really carefully about how that money is going to be used and how we can deploy the skills and expertise that we have in the rich world to make sure that money is used as effectively as it really needs to be. So, question about plastic, and we still have more time for a few questions, so now's your time if you have a question to ask. Plastic, did I see a lot of it? Yeah, I mean, I think especially South Asia in particular has a big plastic problem. I lived in India for 3 years. I saw the problems with waste disposal there. So you have a lot of plastic that is dumped, a lot of plastic that's burned. So these are serious problems. I think it's important to also remember that there are many environmental problems. The plastic problem, plastic pollution is not directly driving climate change in the same way as emissions from cars are. But it's important to remember that these things are linked. Of course, the production of plastics is a huge driver of pollution. And I think this is an opportunity as we address carbon emissions to address much wider issues as well. So we can address the problems of air pollution in cities. We can address the problems of plastic pollution that are devastating the oceans. We can also, by the way, address problems to do with economic inequality. This is something that Al Gore, for example, is very strong on when he talks about the fact you cannot see the climate crisis in isolation. And if we tackle the system that is driving the climate crisis, we can also tackle similar problems and related problems that are driving things like the massive inequality we have in our societies, broader social and health problems that we really struggle with. So the climate crisis is forcing us to reconsider many of the things that underpin our society, our economy. And it's an opportunity that I personally think we shouldn't let go. It's an opportunity to be seized. An opportunity like this to really set these things on a better course may not come again in our lifetimes. So I hope that COP26 will be an important step towards that. So we are out of time. I hope you enjoyed the event. The book is now on sale in, I think, 31 countries, last time I checked. So hopefully for anyone watching, that will include yours. Just go to simonmundy.com and you'll find all the links there. And yeah, I hope we've all got something from COP26, from the discussions around it. I hope that the event itself will yield some sort of really concrete result. But whatever happens from COP26, this is just one more step in what's going to be a very long but very important journey. Thanks so much.